Hi, I'm Lisa from Lori's Country Cottage. Welcome to How Tuesday. Today, I'm going to take you through the steps of making Seeing Stars by Karen Montgomery. Let's talk supplies for Karen Montgomery's Seeing Stars pattern. You require 18 10-inch squares. Now, you can purchase a layer cake and pull out 18 10-inch squares from your layer cake and then use the leftovers for something else if you want. I chose to use one of our kits. We've got these beautiful jewel tone batiks in the store, so I made 10-inch cuts and we made some kits. So I have two 10-inch squares of 9 different colors to give me my 18 10-inch squares. I chose white as a background this time, but this would be a stunning quilt with a black background. She also gives you the yardage for an inside and outside border, plus a printed border in between them. But until I see my quilt top, I wasn't ready to purchase my border fabric, so I didn't. When the center of my quilt is done, I'll decide if there's a multicolored print I'd like to use or which colors I want to pull out for my borders. Now, jewel tone batiks. Did I test this fabric to make sure it didn't run? You bet I did. So how I did that is I took each of my 10-inch strips, I submersed it in warm water in my sink, made sure that I didn't see any color in the water. None of these left color in my water. And then I lay them each on a white paper towel and let them dry. And if any color would have leached into the white paper towel, I would have then washed each piece of fabric with soap in the sink. Because it was only a 10-inch strip, I would not have put that in my washing machine, worried that it would pull things off grain in the agitation. But none of the colors left any dye in my water, and they also did not leave dye on the white paper towel. So these were color safe. And I was relieved because that's extra work. But because I wet these colored fabrics, I also pre-washed my background fabric. So everything had the sizing removed, and if it was going to shrink, everything would shrink equally. So there are some other useful tools you'll want to use if you have for this project. A rotating cutting mat, cutting the 10-inch squares, and then we're going to do lots of trimming in this project. So you can either use your Sue Daily rotating mat or your regular Olfa rotating mat. For cutting your 10-inch squares, I happen to have a 10-inch square ruler from Quilter Select that I purchased for a different project. That was super handy, but all you need is a square ruler that's 10 inches or larger. You'll need a smaller ruler for squaring up. Creative grids are great because they're going to have the diagonal lines and all the little markings that we need for when we trim up our blocks. We're also going to be doing lots of chain stitching. So if you have some kind of chain stitch cutter like the cutting gizmo from the Gypsy Quilter or any of the other chain stitching cutters, that will be super helpful. Make sure you have a nice sharp blade in your rotary cutter as well. For this pattern, we are going to make hourglass blocks. We're going to call them Sarah's Hourglass from the book club that this pattern belongs to, but we're going to arrange the hourglass blocks into Ohio stars. So let's zoom in and we'll start cutting our colored 10-inch squares. Okay, let's take our 10-inch squares and cut them down to size. Each of the 10-inch squares needs to be cut into quarters. So I have my rotating mat here. I'm going to cut on the 5-inch mark, rotate my mat, and again, cut on that 5-inch mark. There we go. Now my 10-inch squares, there's 2 of them here, are cut into quarters. 2 of them we're going to move out of the way. We're going to use those for a different project. 2 of them we're going to cut down to a smaller size, and 2 will remain at 5-inch squares. I wouldn't hesitate. I have a nice sharp blade in my rotary cutter, so I would cut 2 stacks or 4 layers at one time. If you have a layer cake, the edges of your squares will be pinked, but that's okay. There's a little bit of leeway in the pattern so that it's okay. Sometimes layer cakes and charm squares are not perfectly accurate because of that pinked edge. So I'm going to cut the rest of my squares into 5-inch squares, and then we'll come back and do our subcutting of the smaller square. All right, I've got my 10-inch squares cut. This set is going to be used for our bonus project, so I'm going to put that away. These 2 sets are 5-inch squares. They need to remain 5-inch squares, so I'm going to put them there. And we're going to work with this stack of 18 5-inch squares. They all need to be trimmed down to 4 inches square. If you used a layer cake and you have 2 pinked edges on your square, those are the edges that you should trim. So to trim from 5 inches down to 4 inches, I'm just going to take my Creative Grids ruler, measure 4 inches this way, 4 inches this way, and trim up and across the top. So I'm going to do that for the rest of my blocks for this stack, and then we'll come back and get ready for the next step. Working with our 5-inch colored squares and our 5-inch background squares, let's do some subcutting. Take one of your background squares, right side up, your colored square right side down so that they are right sides together, and match them up the best you can. Our first cut will be from corner to corner. So just use a ruler that's long enough, match up the corners, and do your first cut. Now, we are going to cut these across the diagonal again. But Karen says that it's more important that this center angle is exactly 90 degrees than that we cut from point to point. So I'm actually going to separate these and cut them separately. So I'll take a straight line on my ruler, it doesn't matter which line, and line it up with my cut edge perfectly, and then slide my ruler over until I'm at the point. So I have a perfect 90-degree angle, and I'll cut that top set. And now I simply just need to use my rotating mat, turn it, and do the same thing down here. So a straight line on my cut edge, slide my ruler across till I hit the corner of that red fabric, and then make my second cut. Now, I'm going to stack these all up in the right direction, and I know that my longest edge is my stable edge, and these 2 edges are biased edges. So I want to be very careful not to stretch or pull or manipulate them in any way. And I'm just going to go ahead and cut the rest of my 5-inch squares into quarters using Karen's method, and then we'll come back and do some sewing. I've got my stacked up triangles, and to remind you that this and this are the biased edges, the short edges, and the long edge is my stable edge. And now we need to stitch along one of the short edges for all of these little sets. So there's my background fabric, and there's my regular fabric. So I can either stitch this edge or this edge. It is a lot easier to start stitching on a straight edge than it is to start stitching on a point. So I'm going to just simply put this under my foot. I've already started, and stitch that short edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then take my next one. Make sure they're stacked up nicely. In the process of moving them around, they might have shifted a bit, so make sure they're stacked up nicely. All right, that's my first set all done. I would simply just keep sewing and sewing all the colors, but I'll show you how the gypsy cutting gizmo works, and there are other chain stitch cutters that work the same way. I'll just take these and give them a slice, stack them up all the same direction, and then when I press, I'm going to press to my colored stars. If you had a black background, you would press toward the black. And I'll just remind you, as you're stitching, your background fabric should be on the bottom, and all of your squares, or triangles actually, should line up like this. Make sure you don't do anything like that. So I'm going to keep stitching my triangles. I'm going to do my pressing, and then we'll put them together into the hourglass block. I've got my triangles done. They're all pressed to the dark side. So let's make our hourglass blocks. There it is. We'll put it right sides together, matching that center seam. Go ahead and pin if you like. I can feel when my seams are nested nicely. And we're going to chain stitch just like we did with our triangles. There we go. Stitch with your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And once I'm past that center seam, I just want to make sure that everything on this side lines up. I don't want to pull or stretch because those are biased edges. Now that I have that block sewn, again, we'll be chain stitching. Let me show you how it works for pressing. We're going to release these stitches right here in the seam allowance on both sides, just so we can make sure we can make that seam lie flat. So this seam is going this way. We're going to press this seam this way and continue around. When you release those 2 little stitches at the seam allowance, you're able to spin that center seam, and that's how I'm going to press the blocks. So I'm going to continue sewing my hourglass blocks, get them all pressed, and then we'll talk about trimming. I've got into quite of a rhythm pressing my hourglass blocks, so I thought I'd share it with you in hopes that it might help you. So I'm just picking my 2 or 2.5 little stitches out of the back. I make sure I have the seams going the right way and then flip it over. And then to press, I'm just pressing 1/2. Then I'll flip the block over, press the other half, and then catch that middle. Give it a great shot of steam, and then use my clapper to set that seam. And then while that's cooling and kind of setting, I can pick my next couple of stitches make sure the seams are going the right way. Make sure you don't stretch and pull. That's still a biased edge. Press 1/2, press the other half, catch the middle, give it a good shot of steam, and then set it with the clapper. And then you'll just continue on. If you've never used a quilter's clapper before, it's an untreated piece of hardwood. And what it does is it just kind of traps that moisture and the heat in the seam with that added pressure of me kind of clapping it down. And it just really helps to flatten seams even better. And when I have a seam that meets in the middle of the block, I really want that to be flat. So that's just a tip on pressing. I'm going to finish this up and then we'll do some trimming. All right, now we've got our hourglass blocks made, and it's time to square them up to 4 inches. So using your Creative Grids ruler, a square ruler, something with the diagonal line is really important for this. And I'm just going to put this white fabric behind so that you can see. We're looking for the junction of 2 inches and 2 inches. And I've put one of my G-Easy stickers on here so that I can quickly just draw my eye to the 2 by 2 point. And we're going to use that for the first step of squaring up a block. So this diagonal line will run on the diagonal line of my block, and this 2 by 2 point is going to go right in the center. All right, so this diagonal line is perfect, and the 2 by 2 is right in the center of my block. And then I can trim the right side and the top, rotate my mat, and now if I just use the 4 by 4 on my ruler to square up the block, that block line is exactly on my seam line. The 2 by 2 is right in the center of my block, and the 2 4-inch lines are lined up at the outside of my block, and I can trim the other 2 sides. And now I have a perfect 4 by 4 block with that center of the block exactly in the center. So I need to finish trimming all of these blocks, and then it's time to put our quilt together. To decide on the layout of my quilt, I laid out the picture from the pattern and then simply laid down my center squares and decided how to lay them out. I wanted to balance the color as well as balancing the shade of the fabrics. To do that, you can take a picture with your cell phone, click on Edit, and then click on the 3 interlocking circles, and then slide all the way to the left to see it in grayscale. And that just shows you the lightness and the darkness of your fabrics. Once you feel your colors are balanced, it's time to lay out your quilt. Use the diagram from the pattern to lay out all of your squares, stack your columns, and label them appropriately. For this pattern, Karen has you stitch your column 1 and your final column, as well as your row 1 and your final row first. And then she stitches all of the columns together. So go ahead and do that, and then we're ready to stitch all of the columns together and add the top and bottom rows. Here's my finished quilt top. Looks great. Oh, just a minute. Make sure you check every square. Look at those stars on the right. Something's not quite right there. Oh dear, my 3rd column from the right. My blocks are all turned. Oh no, I need to pick it apart, turn those blocks, and make them look right. And that's exactly what I did. Okay, the center of my quilt top is finished. Before you go any further, take some time to really look at your quilt top and make sure that all of your blocks are in the right direction. I laid my quilt out, gave it a really good overview. It looked great. And when I went to pick out borders and I laid my quilt out on the table, I noticed that I had one block turned sideways. So I just did some reverse stitching, turned it around, and now the center of my quilt is great. I had a little trouble picking borders for this project, only for one reason. I like, when I'm showing you a how-to for a project or a quilt, to follow the writer's instructions. So Karen has 3 borders on her quilt. The inner and outer border are the same fabric, and then she has a print in between. If this was my quilt, I would have done something different. So I struggled a bit picking out my borders. I'm happy with what I have now. My inner and outer border are going to be this beautiful teal, and so will the binding. And then my middle border is going to be the white. Also, I had one other problem before moving on to the borders. It's clear from the picture in Karen's pattern that she does mitered borders, but the instructions inside are for regular borders. I'd like to show you mitered borders and how to put them on the quilt. So we're going to go ahead and do it the way the picture shows, not how the instructions say. Let's put some borders on my quilt top. Instead of doing traditional borders, I want to do mitered borders. Sometimes I do mitered borders just to save some time. It is a time-saving technique. Also, sometimes when I use a really beautiful print, the mitered borders don't show the seams as much. So that's why you would choose to do multiple mitered borders. The first thing you need to do for mitered borders is do the math, quilter's math. And here's how to figure out how much fabric you need for your multiple mitered borders. Mitered borders are done in a completely different technique. So for this project, I have an inner border in turquoise, a middle border of white, and then an outer border again of turquoise. So I'm going to cut my strips exactly like the pattern says. I'm going to join them all in a long row, so I'll have all of my strips of inner border together, all of my strips of middle border together, and then all of my strips of the outside border together. And then I'm going to piece them together. So I will have my inner, middle, and outside border and a giant strip the entire length of the fabric. And here's why we do it. We're going to cut the borders that are already assembled to the appropriate length, sew them on all 4 sides, leaving those corners, and then we'll miter the corners. So how do I know how long to make those borders? If you have a square quilt, your 4 borders will be the same size and you'll only have 1 measurement to use. But this is a rectangular quilt, so we have 2 measurements, the width and the length. So here's the formula for how long to cut your borders for mitered borders. You need the width of your quilt plus twice the unfinished width of your border plus 2 to 4 inches to play around. So my quilt is approximately 39 wide. My unfinished border, once I piece the 3 together, will be 8.5 inches. I need to double that, so it's 17 inches. So the width of my quilt is 39 plus 17, plus I'm going to add 4 inches so I don't have to worry. So the width of my quilt, I will cut 2 60-inch pieces. And then I'll redo the same math for the length. The length of my quilt plus 2 times the unfinished width of the border plus 4 inches. So it'll be approximately 53 long. My 17 inches, that's the 8.5 times 2, plus 4 inches. I'll have 2 lengths of 74 inches for the length of my quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and piece my borders, my inner, middle, outside border in 1 long strip. I'm going to cut it to the appropriate length, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, let's attach those borders. Here are my border strips. I sewed one long strip of my inside border, middle border, and outside border, and then cut them to the appropriate length for my multiple border mitered corners. All right. The next thing I did was to take each border piece and mark the middle. And then, just like you see here, I pinned in the middle, and then I use wonder clips to go all the way from the middle to each edge. And then you'll see that you have the extra pieces that allow you to miter your border. So I'll just finish attaching this border with my wonder clips. You can use pins if you like. And then the only other step you need to do is on the front of your quilt is to mark a 1/4 inch in from each corner of your quilt. And here's why. I've attached my 2 long sides and my short side to my quilt top. And I did that by starting 1/4 of an inch in, stitching down the length of the side and stopping a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And I did that on those 3 sides. And now I just have to do one more side. So how you do that is you just fold this back, put your border down, and then stitch from the 1/4 inch all the way and stop a 1/4 inch from the end. So I'm going to do that for my last border, and then we're going to miter the borders. All right, I've stitched that last border on. Let's miter the corners. Mitering corners scares people, but I love it, and I don't find it hard at all. So let me show you how it's done. Here is the extra fabric from one side, and here's the extra fabric from the other side. Sometimes the hardest part is just remembering how to fold your quilt. So what I want to do is create a diagonal line from here and fold my quilt right sides together. Then these 2 tails actually lay together. So this just takes some fiddling, it takes some time, and if you do this part right, your mitered corners are really nice. So the first thing I'm going to do is lay my borders so that they line up this way. I don't care how long they are, that doesn't need to line up. But I want this to be a straight edge and this to be a straight edge. And then I'm going to look at, when I do that, and then I flatten my quilt, is this a nice diagonal line? Now, with the stars on my quilt, it's super easy to see that this goes to this point, to this point, to this point. I have correctly folded my quilt on that diagonal line. And so everything looks good, but we're going to double check, and we're going to shift things if we need to. You're going to need a long ruler for the next step. Don't try and do it with a short ruler. The longer the ruler, the more accurate you are. So I'm just going to start by laying my ruler along that folded edge. And when I do that, I'm just looking here, it's on my folded edge. Now I want to see, does it pass through that 1/4 inch stop where I started and stopped my border? If it doesn't, I need to do a little shifting, and mine's off about a stitch. So that's not going to work. If I stitch on that line, I'm going to have a pucker at that corner. So I just need to shift my diagonal line a wee bit. So I'm going to do that. Again, line up my strip so it's flat, and I'm looking at my 1/4 inch stitch where I started and stopped my border, and now it lines up with that diagonal line. Let's try it again. So again, I'm just going to lay my ruler on the diagonal line of my fabric and then check. does it go through that 1/4 inch. Well, now it goes through perfectly. And I haven't given myself enough ruler to get to the end of my border. So I'll just slide it down. And it's absolutely perfect. This diagonal line goes right through the start and stop of my 1/4 inch. My borders are lined up. I'm just gonna snug it up just a bit more. And when I think it's perfect, I want this stitching line to line up with the stitching line of the bottom piece, because I'm going to stitch and I want them to line up. So now I'll just take a pencil and from that 1/4 inch mark, draw a line. That's going to be my stitching line. So if you're on dark fabric, use your silver quilter's pencil or a white pen. And now I have it lined up perfectly. I have my line drawn, and I'm going to pin it so that nothing shifts. And I'm just going to look, those seams are perfectly stacked, and I don't want them to shift. So I'm going to place a pin. And then I look here, my seams are perfectly stacked, and in goes another pin, and then just a pin to hold all those layers together. I'm going to do that for the other 3 corners, and then I'm going to stitch from that 1/4 inch mark where I started and stopped my borders to the outside of the border. Then I'll open it up and see if they're perfect or not. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of adjusting, but let me mark my other 3 corners, stitch them, and then we'll come back and see how they turn out. All right, I've got my 4 corners sewn on that mitered angle. So just a note on pressing, you'll see that I haven't pressed this border. For the aesthetics of my quilt, I'd like to press the seam this way toward the dark side, but in order to stitch my mitered corner, I need these seam allowances flipped up so that I can see that point to start. So I did not press ahead of time. Once I stitch and check that my seam is nice, I can go ahead and press that any way I want once it's trimmed. So let's see how it turned out. And this seam allowance, you don't cut till you know you're completely happy with your corner. So what I'm looking for here is how well do I match here and how well do I match here, and do I have a pucker at this corner, keeping in mind that I can do just a tiny bit of manipulation with my iron. So I do have just a wee bit. I feel like that's just the seam allowance running into each other. So I'm really happy with this corner. That matches nicely and that matches nicely. I'll check my other 3 corners, and if I needed to adjust anything, sometimes all you need to do is pick out your first or second stitch. You've just gone a half a hair too close to that corner, and sometimes by just releasing one stitch, that will lay nice and flat. But I'm really happy with this corner. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my ruler and trim off this tail so that I just have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So why don't I do that now? Because I'm happy with this one. Be very careful not to cut your quilt at this point. Now I can take this to my iron, and I'm going to press that seam open, and it'll be a nice flat seam. And then I can go ahead and press those seam allowances to the outside like I'd like to, so that my seam allowance doesn't show through my white fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and check my other 3 corners and make sure everything lines up. If, for instance, on the front of my quilt, this didn't line up nice, I can simply release some stitches, pin on either side, and then just make sure they line up perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. There we go, my borders are on my quilt. I love how the mitered border turned out. When I first started doing mitered borders and mitered corners, I did need to do sometimes just a little bit of fiddling with that corner, but having had some experience, now I'm pretty good at it. I like doing, if I'm doing multiple borders, I like to do mitered borders. I find it a lot easy to sew my strip set, cut it to length. It doesn't need to be perfectly accurate, and then just spend a little bit of time on those mitered corners rather than sewing on the inner border on the sides and the top and the bottom, then the middle border and then the outer border. So I like putting them on as a strip set, and it saves some time. So I hope you enjoyed learning how to attach multiple borders with a mitered corner. Thank you for joining me for How Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make hourglass blocks and then how to turn them into Ohio stars, and making the quilt Seeing Stars by Karen Montgomery.